What up, Chess YouTube? In today's video, Magnus Carlsen squeezes the life out of the aggressive attacking player Alireza Firouzja in the Berlin variation of the Ruy Lopez Opening. And of course, this game just took place in the 2024 Norway Chess Tournament. Now here, Magnus Carlsen has a choice. How does he want to respond to Alireza Firouzja's Berlin defense to the Ruy Lopez? Well, the two most popular ideas for white are going to be simply castles kingside and d3, supporting the pawn on the e4 square. Here, Magnus, he goes castles, good move, and black goes to the main idea in the Berlin. That is simply knight takes e4. Now, once again, Magnus has a big choice. Do you want to go rook e1, trying to squeeze out an advantage in the middle game, or do you go for the end game, starting with d4? Well, in the game, he goes rook to e1, and this is a very popular line against the Berlin variation. White here is going to get a small lead in development in a very symmetrical pawn structure, and Magnus Carlsen's goal with this is to slowly squeeze the life out of Alireza Firouzja throughout this game. Now, black goes knight to d6. The knight was being attacked on the d4 square, so simply retreating, getting out of the attack. Now, white takes on e5, and of course, now white has all sorts of discovered attacks on the e-file. For example, knight takes c6, hitting the queen and the king with the rook. So with that in mind, black here, bishop to e7, simply blocking the rook on the open e-file. Very good move. Now white, his bishop on the b5 square is being attacked. So with that in mind, he retreats the bishop. Bishop f1. So far, this is all theory. Now here, black takes on e5. White takes back. Both sides have exchanged a pair of knights, and now black castles. So far, so good. And this is the real starting point of the 5 rook e1 variation of the Berlin defense. Now white here, his main advantage in this position is his lead in development. He already has the rook out on the open e-file, and it's going to be much easier for him to get all of his queenside pieces out into the game. Whereas on the other hand, black, his rook still not developed on the open e-file, and that knight on the d6 square in particular is going to make it incredibly hard for him to develop the rest of his queenside. So with that in mind, Magnus needs to start something right here, right now. In the game, he goes d4, gaining space in the center. Very solid move. The only real alternative to d4 here is going to be the idea starting with knight to c3. The main line involves jumping to the d5 square right away, trying to win that bishop on the e7 square. But of course, Magnus not playing that in the game. d4 played. Now black plays the main move here. Bishop s6, hitting the rook. And surprisingly, white does have some different choices here. The main line and the move Magnus played in the game is simply rook to e1. However, rook to e2 surprisingly is also possible. And white can even play the absolutely insane looking idea of bishop to d3, simply sacrificing the rook on the e5 square in exchange for very rapid development and an attack against the black king. Now from here, of course, Magnus rook e1, the most solid move, most popular option, and here black finally goes rook to e8, simply challenging white's rook on the open e-file. Now of course here, once again, Magnus Carlsen has a wide choice of options. The main problem Magnus has to solve is, do you want to exchange the rooks on the e8 square, or do you want to wait and allow black to do it on e1? Well, in the game, Magnus goes for the move c3, very solid move, simply bolstering the square on d4, and here black strikes at the opportunity to exchange the rooks. Alireza getting those rooks off the board. Unfortunately for black, now Magnus has the queen on the open e-file. He may be able to use that later in the game. Now from here, black, of course, his main problem is going to be that knight on the d6 square. That knight is blocking the d-pawn from getting into the game, and it stops black's bishop on c8 from entering the game as well. So with that in mind, here black, knight to e8, very common move. The idea is you want to go d5 next, then perhaps knight to d6, and then maybe bishop f5, finally completing your queenside development. Now Magnus here, he has a choice. If he were to slow play the position, perhaps going knight d2 to f3, bishop f4, queen e2, rook e1, and so on, those moves are all perfectly solid, perfectly fine. However, the problem is Alireza Firouzja may be able to equalize, and if he does, he simply gets a draw in position. So with that in mind, Magnus Carlsen here decides to create an imbalance on the board. He pushes his d-pawn forward to the d5 square. Oh, I absolutely love this move. There's now a permanent imbalance, white having more space in the center. However, that pawn on the d5 square could become a weakness if Magnus Carlsen is not careful. Now here, what the heck is Alireza Firouzja supposed to do? In the game, he goes queen e7, simply challenging white's queen on the d1 square. However, that is not such a big deal. And of course, there were some alternatives, but none of them are very good. For example, if black here were to go c6, trying to challenge white's pawn on the d5 square, then white has a variety of options. Simply c4, defending is possible, and once again, white maintains that space space advantage. However, there are some other really interesting ideas. For example, here, white can simply ignore the pawn if he wants to, go bishop e3, and after c takes d5, go queen d2. And here, black has a very, very difficult time hanging on to that pawn on the d5 square, and meanwhile, white has pretty good development. So as you can see, both sides have lots and lots of options in this position. Here, black, of course, going queen e7. Now, Magnus once again has a choice. Do you want to keep the queens on the board, or do you want to exchange queens and go into an endgame? Well, real fast, if Magnus Carlsen did exchange queens and when queen takes e7, then most of his advantage would slip away. That pawn on the d5 square would become a weakness, and black would simply bring his king into the game and have at least an equal position. So with that in mind, Magnus plays the best move, queen to d1, simply keeping those queens on the board for now. Now here, black, once again, his main problem, of course, is going to be those queenside pieces. First of all, how the heck do you want to get that bishop on c8 into the game? It's either going to be on b7 or on this diagonal here somewhere, perhaps bishop f5, something like that. So of course, the main ideas for black here are going to be b6 or d6. Now in the game, black goes for the move b6, and personally, I'm always a little bit skeptical of the idea of getting the bishop on b7 in these kinds of lines. It always looks a little bit suspicious to me. So with that in mind, d6 also playable. I just want to show you some ideas here. Magnus, once again, he has a wide range of ideas to try and continue putting on pressure. So for example, a4, intending a5 is possible. Queen to b3, putting pressure on the b7 square, perfectly playable. And finally, knight to d2, intending knight to f3, also good for white. Now, back to the game. b6 played. Of course, that bishop is coming out to the b7 square. And what does Magnus want to do about it? Well, in the game, he has a very interesting way to get the rest of his queenside pieces developed here. He starts with the move a4, and of course, this move threatens various things, potentially a5, maybe even a6 in the future. So with that in mind, black needs to lock down the queenside immediately. He plays the move a5, very good. And here, Magnus has a few different ways to take advantage of the advanced placement of his a-pawn. In the game, he goes knight to a3, real fast. The other crazy-looking idea is rook to a3. The idea is you want to go c3 to c4 later, and you may have potential rook lift ideas on the third rank. So that would have been really cool to see. Instead, knight to a3. What the heck is Magnus Carlsen's idea here? Well, he's going to show you on the next move. Here, black, bishop b7, very logical. And now Magnus, knight to c4. He jumps in with his knight. Now, technically, this was not the most precise move with the knight. Instead, b5 or c2 are both slightly more accurate moves. For example, real fast, from b5, the main idea of this move is the knight is pressuring c7. It also has the idea of taking on d6 if black ever goes knight d6, and white also has the very good square d4 for the knight in the future. Overall, knight b5 may have been a slightly better idea. Instead, knight c4 in the game. Of course, this is Magnus freaking Carlsen. He may have a good idea for it, so let's not count him out yet. Now here, Alireza Firouzja, he has the ability to take advantage of this mistake by Magnus. The best move is simply knight to d6. Now, white's best idea is simply taking on d6, and black is going to take back with the queen. And take a look at this position. Suddenly, that pawn on the d5 square has turned into a weakness, and black, believe it or not, is actually slightly better placed here. So, Alireza Firouzja missing a chance to simply seize control of the game. Instead of that, he plays the move bishop g5 here. Now, this move does make a lot of sense. The idea is black is simply trying to trade one pair of minor pieces off the board, and that makes his space advantage a little bit less of a big deal. Now here, Magnus, how does he increase the pressure? Well, in the game, he plays a really, really cool idea. That is simply d6. Now, of course, first of all, this pawn move is forking the pawns on c7 and the queen on e7. Black has to respond now, and in the game, black takes with the knight, but this is exactly what white wants. Here, white takes the bishop on g5, deflecting the queen away from the defense of the knight on the d6 square. Queen takes g5, and now Magnus takes on d6 twice, takes with the knight, then recaptures the pawn with the queen. And this is exactly what Magnus Carlsen wanted in this game as white. Take a look at this. Black here has 3 pawn islands versus the 2 pawn islands of white, and that means black's pawns are permanently going to be vulnerable in this game. That means whether it's a middle game or an end game, Magnus is going to have a small edge, and as we're going to see in this game, Magnus just slowly squeezes the life out of his opponent here. And real fast, contrast, of course, black may have some mating ideas on g2, that bishop on f1 for now defending the g2 square. So, of course, Magnus going to have to keep his bishop on f1 for a little while. Now, how does black proceed? Bishop c6 first. So, very solid move, simply defending the d7 pawn with the bishop. Now, Magnus, rook e1, centralizing the rook, and here black has a very big decision to make. To be honest, there isn't a whole lot he can do actively in this game. Technically, he can offer to trade queens with queen d5. That would be a decent move. The computer also seems to like simply h6, just a waiting move. Of course, after h6, it's going to be a lot harder for white to do any sort of back rank mate ideas. However, in the game, Alireza played simply a worse version of the idea of queen d5 trading queens. He went queen to f6. Now, this move was super surprising. Here, Magnus takes on f6, black takes back with the g-pawn, and now look at black's pawn structure in this game. This is just horrific. Oh my goodness, this is more than Magnus Carlsen could have hoped for in this kind of game. Now here, Magnus starts b3. Of course, the pawn on the a4 square was being attacked by that bishop on c6. Now black, rook to b8. Interesting ideas. The idea is trying to go b5 in the future, activating the rook and putting pressure on white's weak pawns on the queen side. However, fortunately for Magnus, he really doesn't have to worry about the idea of b5. So for example, one of the best moves here for Magnus is going to be f4. The idea of this is you are gaining space on the king side, and beyond that, the king is a very easy route into the middle of the board from there. Now, for example, if black were to go b5 after a takes, bishop takes, rook to b1, white here has everything perfectly defended, and black's weak pawns are going to be a telling factor throughout this endgame. However, here on move 25, instead of going c4, Magnus Carlsen respects the idea of b5 from black a little bit too much. He goes c4, trying to clamp down on that square forever, and this gives black just enough time to get rid of one of his pawns here. He goes d5, breaking in the center, getting rid of that weak d pawn, and there's not a whole lot Magnus can do about it. Now, Magnus obviously taking on d5 would not be good. Black would take back with the bishop, targeting that pawn on the b3 square, so Magnus simply jumps in with the rook to the e7 square. Very solid move. Now, black here, the obvious move is going to be rook to b7. The idea is you're simply challenging white's rook on e7, and of course, e8 is not an available square for white's rook because the bishop on c6 controls that. So from there, white's going to have to retreat the rook back along the e-file, and black's going to be perfectly fine. However, Alireza Firouzja doesn't see that. He goes rook to c8, and this move, it turns out, is just a little bit too passive. Here, Magnus goes f3, preparing the idea of king f2, then king to e3, and suddenly, once again, Magnus Carlsen has a little bit of an edge in this game. Now, from here, black takes on c4, white takes back. There are no bishop d5 ideas, and here, Alireza Firouzja spots an interesting tactic. Here in this position, bishop takes a4, solid idea. The idea is if you ever take the bishop on the a4 square, black simply takes the bishop on c4. Of course, that pawn on b3 was defending the bishops. That is a deflection sacrifice of the bishop. Now, of course, black's pawn on f7 is hanging here. White simply takes, bishop takes f7, black goes king f8, and here Magnus Carlsen demonstrates his principiance with a very accurate move, rook to a7. Now, personally, when I first saw this, I was like, wait a minute, what about rook to b8? Isn't that more logical, also attacking the pawn on the b6 square? Well, Magnus is simply one step ahead of me. Here's what happens. Rook to b7. Here, black can go bishop to c6, hitting the rook. Of course, that rook has to maintain defense of that bishop on the f7 square, meaning it can only go to a7. And here, compared to the prior line, black gets the extra move, bishop c6 in for free. So with that in mind, Magnus here in this position demonstrates his sagacity with a very accurate move, rook to a7. There will be no intermediate move, bishop to c6 in this game. Now here, Alireza, bishop b5, and Magnus starts to gain space on the king side with h4. And from here, he slowly brings his king into the game. Alireza gives a check on the c2 square, and Magnus has a choice. Do you want to go to e3 or g3? Well, it turns out g3 is actually the better square for the king. And here's why. If white went king to e2, black has this very annoying check on the e2 square. And for example, if white kings jumps forward to the f4 square, here black can simply go rook to e7. And of course, that rook's attacking both the rook on a7 and the bishop, meaning white has to take on e7. And this is very good for black. Here, black may even have an advantage thanks to his queenside pawns over here, as black is going to very soon have a pass pawn on the queenside and threaten to promote. That is a very good thing. So going back to this position here, Magnus Carlsen Carlsen not going king e3, instead demonstrating his percipience with the move king to g3 here. Now Alireza rook to e2, keeping the rook active. Magnus rook b7, threatening that pawn on the b6 square. And it turns out there's not a whole lot black can do to defend the pawn on b6. So with that in mind, bishop to d3. And here Magnus, instead of taking on b6, plays a very clever idea. Bishop to c4. He wants those bishops off the board. Now it may look like Magnus is simply giving up the opportunity to win the pawn on the b6 square, but he has an idea. Here, after bishop takes c4, pawn takes c4, suddenly Magnus has the double attack on the pawns on b6 and h7, meaning Magnus is going to win at least one of them. The important thing before was simply getting those bishops off the board, and he did that successfully. Now here, black rook to c2, threatening the pawn on the c4 square. Magnus takes on b6. Black goes king to g7, defending the pawn on f6. Of course, the rook was now attacking it over there. And here, both sides decide to clean up the pawns on the queen side. Black wins the pawn on c4, Magnus on a5, and now we have an absolutely critical position in this endgame. Here, Magnus has the one pawn majority on the king side. Of course, he has 3 pawns versus Alireza Firouzja's 2 pawns, and if you know anything about rook endgames, this endgame here is technically drawn. There's that old saying, all rook endgames are drawn, and it's definitely true here. However, Magnus does have the one pawn advantage on the king side, and that means he can press risk-free for literally the rest of the game, trying to short out a mistake by Alireza. And if he does make that mistake, it's going to be game over because Magnus is literally the best endgame player ever. Okay, I'm going to show the rest of the game a little bit faster here. Here, Magnus, he starts by pushing the pawn up to the h5 square and bring his king into the game on f5. Very good stuff. However, here, black h6, simply locking down the king side, and white has to find a way to make progress. Now, of course, white's long-term plan is going to be pushing those pawns up, perhaps to g4 and f5, and then sharking around with the king and the rook, looking for a mistake from black. So with that in mind, both sides start sharking around. They're just moving their pieces back and forth, trying to eke out mistakes from each other. And finally, Magnus starts his plan, f4, gaining space on the king side. All right, here we go. Magnus also g3. And a lot more sharking around here, nothing too much happening until finally, here in this position, Magnus Carlsen, boom, f5, gaining even more space on the king side. And of course, g4 is going to come very, very soon. Here it is on the board, g4. So phase 1 of Magnus Carlsen's plan is in the books. Now he has to find a way to eke out a mistake from black. That way he can target these pawns on the f6 squares and h6. All right, here, Alireza, rook to e7. His idea is he is threatening rook to e4, at which point that pawn on the g4 square would fall. Now, you might be thinking Magnus is going to go rook to e4 defending, and if you thought that, you thought wrong. Here, Magnus king to d6, literally sacrificing that pawn on the g4 square. Does Magnus have an idea? Let's find out. Rook to a7, king f8. Very importantly, the king is now trapped on the 8th rank. The rook cuts it off, and here, Magnus, what does he do? He simply goes rook to b7. He's allowing black to take the pawn. The idea behind this is if black takes on g4, Magnus is going to bring his king over to the e5 square, then gobble up that pawn on f6. Okay, let's see what Alireza does. In the game, he takes the pawn on g4, and that turns out to be a mistake. Instead, let's say Alireza went rook to g8. In this position, there is literally nothing that Magnus Carlsen can do to make progress. I mean, just think about it. The rook on the e-file simply cuts the king off from the king side. If Magnus ever goes rook to b8, black goes king g7, and again, the king is cut off. There's literally nothing that white can do here. So with that in mind, it does look logical taking the pawn on g4. However, this just gives Magnus Carlsen more chances. King e6, and we have a game. All right, now Magnus, he sharks around. Of course, he can take on f6 literally whenever he wants. He does that here. King takes f6. Now Alireza gives the check on the a6 square. King e5 for Magnus. Rook b6, Alireza just playing a waiting move. Now Magnus, rook d6, offering the trade of rooks. Now this is super important. Do you know your king and pawn endgames? Let me know. Is white going to be winning if black takes the rook on d6? It is super, super important. I mean, in this kind of position, Alireza simply needs to know right away without even thinking about it if it's a go or if it's a no-go. And in the game, he actually takes the rook on d6. And this turns out to be an absolutely massive blunder. Instead of that, the best move, simply rook b2 or rook to b1, just playing a waiting move with the rook. Instead, rook takes d6. He literally trades into a theoretically lost endgame. Let's see if Magnus can pull it off. King takes d6. King f7, king e5, best move, king e7. It looks like black has the opposition with the kings. However, Magnus f6 here. Now after king to f8, king to f4. And here Magnus Carlsen is simply winning. Check it out. King e8, king e4. And in this position, black resigns. Alireza Firouzja had the life squeezed out of him by Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game.